We're back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, and we're going to read to 15, verse 15. It says this: Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Don't come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, Well, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. You all can be seated. So a couple of years ago, I found myself at Taylor Books. Anybody love Taylor Books in Charleston? Yes. I found myself there grabbing an overpriced vanilla lavender latte that was way too lavendery. And I was meeting up with a former student who was passing through the area on a work trip. And to protect his story and his vulnerability this morning, we'll just call him Mike. Can everybody say Mike? It's a very, very obscure name you've probably never heard of. I think we have 17 Mikes in the building this morning. But call it a gut instinct, call it a vibe, call it discernment, wherever you are on this journey. But as soon as we sat down at the small round table in the corner by the window right next to the fish tank, I could sense that something bigger may be up. The conversation at first, it was very light. It sat right at the surface as two old friends catching up. It always seems to go. We remembered some old stories. We recalled some of my very dumb jokes that I used to tell in class all the time. Dumb jokes that I get from my not dumb father, but is the teller of dumb jokes. It is hereditary. We laughed about my severely overgrown and undergroomed beard from that era. If you know, you know, but if you don't, consider it a gift. We talked about some of our favorite moments, road tripping for soccer games, and even that one time we got to go overseas together on a mission trip. And it typically does with someone you know well, regardless of the time between the last conversation to the present one, the deeper bond prevailed and eventually things started to get more real. You see, Mike, former soccer player on my team, a former student in an era when my age gap to those high schoolers wasn't that far. He knew me during those tough years post-divorce, And so he asked me about Eliza in a way only someone who saw my pain and hoped for better for me would ask. He knew me during the years I was navigating a process of discerning whether to continue being a teacher, go into school leadership, maybe even go overseas, or become a pastor. And so he asked me lots of questions about the church and how it was going. Mike was a student, and he was a player, and we became friends. He knew me, and I knew him. And he knew me in a season where I had been through some stuff, and I knew him in a season where he had been through some stuff. And since our last talk, I knew there had been some more stuff we hadn't caught up on. And so when I asked him about how he was adjusting and how he was loving this brand new thing called being a dad, hashtag girl dad nonetheless, we shared that, he got quiet. And his quietness turned into a quivering chin and the slow trickling of a tear down his cheek. And through broken words and unexpected emotion, Mike told me how the joy of his newfound fatherhood was bringing about the stirrings of regret at the relationship he had endured with his own dad. And what made that tension so complicated, so profound, and so unfixable was that his dad had passed away about a year prior to our conversation of an unexpected heart attack. And so the joy of his newfound journeyhood into his own fatherhood was held in tension with the pains of regret and unmendedness with his own father who is now gone. So sitting there at an ordinary space with an overpriced vanilla lavender latte by a fish tank on a window with people passing by, this ordinary Tuesday morning turned into something that was nothing but ordinary. Without meaning to, I had inadvertently struck that untouchable place inside of him with a single question. The one he kept covered up, the one he kept bottled up. It was the one he was sure God's grace could not touch. And like Mike, we all tend to carry a part of our lives like that. Some part of our lives that we can't forgive ourselves for, and so we assume God can't or doesn't even want to forgive either. We all tend to hold some part of our lives, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we can name it or not. We all tend to hold some part of ourselves outside the supposed reach of God's grace. And then one day, you're drinking a cup of coffee with an old friend in public, and they ask you about some new journey into fatherhood, and suddenly you come undone. Words don't come, but tears do. Because sometimes it's the simplest things that uncovers the part of you that never gets to see the light of day. We all, every last one of us, are Mike. And this whole burning bush story is actually about the same thing. It's about three things. It's about what God remembers, it's about what we forget, and it's about how God gets his work done. Now, to catch us back up in the story we just dove straight into a particular scene of in Exodus, remember that God, the author of Exodus, has laid out a cosmic narrative about sin and rescue and salvation, about the stages we go from creation into enslavement to liberation and into renewal, from the things that trap us and hinder us and hold us back and into the things that is life and life to the full of Jesus calls it. The author is setting into motion things that will come fulfilled in the life and the teachings of Jesus, things that look back to Genesis redemptively and things that look forward to Jesus with anticipation. In this story, we then zoom in, and as we've seen the last 2 weeks, we are focused on a single character that goes by the name of Moses. A person who will go through his own Exodus story 2 times before God calls him and uses him to redeem and rescue the people of Israel into their ultimate Exodus. Last week we saw that Moses had some stuff with his childhood and his identity, and it flared up in a moment where it caused him to murder someone on behalf of his people, then to find rejection by those same people that he acted out on a day later, and in response, he ran. It has now been 40 years since that episode. And because he fed some people at a well, he found a wife, had some kids, and has just been living in obscurity. And then comes this very familiar and very peculiar scene at the burning bush. So what is going on here? Let's ask this question. Why is God appearing to Moses in the first place? It's because of what God remembers. God remembers what? Well, God remembers his promises. God remembers his covenant, and God has a plan. In just a couple of verses before what we read today, it says this, that during that long period, those 40-year gap, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Now, there isn't enough time to take you through the whole scriptural theme of this, but I'll just get to the punchline and say that in Scripture and in life, injustice always makes a sound that God hears. Injustice always makes a sound that God hears, not just in the past, but in the world right now. Injustice, the cries for help from your life and from the cosmic things that are happening in our world, injustice is making a sound that God hears. So God hears his people's cry for help, and what's his track record? That he always responds. And so, as it always does, the people's cry for help comes together and it matches God's unchanging, unshakable promise that he has made, this time with Joseph's ancestors, and in the story we see through Genesis, something that God initiated long ago. And it's said this way by the Exodus author that says, God heard their groaning and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God took notice. So injustice makes a sound as the people cry out. God hears, and then God does what? God remembers. Everybody say, God remembers. I'm telling a story this morning, so stick with it. And when I say God remembers, our brains are trained to make that sound like God forgot something. Like, wait a second. The God who's always faithful, the unchanging, unshakable, covenant-keeping God, what do you mean he forgot something? That's a limitation of English language in that moment. Because what that doesn't mean is that God was distracted, God was aloof, God was distant, God didn't care, and God had forgotten the promise he made. It's the author's best attempt to say to the reader that the thing that God knew all along, he was becoming more aware of. He tuned himself into. He heard the cries and he attached that to the covenant that it's long been established and was continuing to unfold. He heard their cries for help and he remembers. God always remembers. Thank God, God always remembers. What that means is he hears not just their ancient cry for help, it means he hears your cry for help. He's hearing your cry for help. It means he knows your situation. It means he sees the injustice of the world and in your life, and he is actively, as he always has, is working a rescue story that is bigger than you can imagine, but often slower than you would prefer. God hears their cries. God remembers his promise, and he responds, in this case, by raising up a very unlikely protagonist in his story, Moses. What do you mean, Moses? The baby that was rescued from a river, the man that murdered and then ran, the guy that is now 80 years old with, I'm assuming, the greatest beard of all time. He is tending to animals at 80 years old, and that's the guy that God says you're going to set the people free. Remember the people you tried to set free on your own without me, and you murdered a guy and they turned their back, and that was 40 years ago? You're the guy. You're the guy. And he uses the most unlikely person. The Lord said, I have seen the misery of my people. I've heard them. and because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land. This is God's way of telling Moses, you have forgotten something, but I haven't. It's not that God is remembering something he's forgotten. It's God's way of telling Moses, you don't understand yet, but I am exactly who I've always been. I'm who your people have rumored me to be. Remember I was the God of Isaac and Jacob and all the guys and all the generations and all the stories of your Hebrew imagination, the stories you grew up. I'm still that God. It's not that I've forgotten you. It's that somewhere in that mix, I think maybe you've forgotten who I am. The God who keeps his promises. And in that statement alone, it's a profound invitation to trust that God is a God who remembers his promises. But that's going to be tough for Moses, as it is for us, because God remembers, but here's the second thing, we forget. Now, there's something bigger in the text that I just have to point you towards, or I will feel like a failure as your pastor this morning. It's a bit technical, but it is so profound, and I would encourage you, don't take my word for it, take some credit there, and then move on and read some more, because you can mine this out for richness after richness after richness. And here's the big idea, that somewhere between Genesis and Exodus, the Israelites have forgotten God's name. They've forgotten God's name. In Genesis, God is Yahweh. He's the personal God. That's his personal name, like a friend, someone I know. It's Matt, it's Evan, it's John, it's Mike, it's the name that's personal. But in Exodus, the author is referring to God as Elohim. Elohim, that's like a title. That is a concept, an idea. It's someone I've heard of, but distant. And that's important because carried in the weight of a name in the average person of Hebrew descent in their imagination is that someone's name is the tightest and the shortest descriptor of someone's character. My name isn't just Matt. It would be the way of describing who I am, my character, and my relationship to God. Israel has journeyed from a personal relationship with Yahweh to a distant way of remembering God as Elohim. As in, when God is reminding him, hey, I was the God of so, they knew me as Yahweh, but something shifted where you, Moses, and your people now know me as an idea, a concept, a construct of the past. Your oppression, your enslavement, your situation, your suffering has clouded and distanced your concept of who I am. Said a lot more concisely, God is remembered, but they've forgotten who he is. So as God and Moses are talking back and forth at the burning bush, God is revealing himself more and more. He's reminding him of who he is and who he has been. And God introduces himself 2 times. All right, we're still being a little technical, but follow. 2 times. The first time is in verse 13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God, which is Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you. They ask me, what is his name? Interesting. Then what shall I tell them? And Elohim, God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And then here's a second introduction. God also said to Moses, so Moses says to God and recounts who God is, this question is Elohim. Then God reintroduces himself to Moses and he says this, well, say to your people, the Israelites, the Lord, which is Yahweh. Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the personal God, the one you can know, the one that has been the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. Because this, Yahweh, is my name forever. It's the name you shall call me from generation to generation. That's the second introduction that God makes to Moses. The first is by a title, the second is personal. And in that precise moment, everything changes. The story pivots, and the burning bush becomes holy ground for Moses, in part because Moses remembered what he had forgotten. He forgot who God was. In his misery and in his suffering and in the oppression of his people and in the 40 years that his flight or fight response sent him into the wilderness, away from his people and away from his purpose, having shamed him and supposedly destroyed his capacity to be used by God, Yahweh became Elohim, and in a moment Elohim came back as Yahweh. God's name, his person, his character, his track record was all of a sudden alive and revealed to Moses again. It wasn't just Elohim who they're crying out to, it is Yahweh, the one who hears the sound of injustice and responds as he always has. But it wasn't that simple for Moses, and it never is for us either. So God has closed the gap. Something personally, uniquely. God has appeared to a Moses, this time in a burning bush, which there's just not enough time, which is a redemption story of the other tree in the garden that cursed all of humanity. God appears to Moses in a tree to help liberate Moses into an ultimate exodus, a tree that later Jesus will be crucified on to pay for the sins of the world. There's a theme so deeply embedded in here that all becomes alive to us when we remember what we forgot, and God shows himself as Yahweh to a people who've discarded him as Elohim. But something else happened for Moses between these introductions. And it helped Moses rediscover God's lost identity. It was this: Moses rediscovered his identity. When God laid out his plan to use Moses, this cast-out 80-year-old who had disgraced his people and wasted his life by every human measurement, Moses launched two objections, both phrased in the form of questions. The first question was this: who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And then a couple verses later he says, suppose I go to them and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what's his name? What shall I tell them? Moses asks two questions. Who am I? And who are you, God? Who am I that you would, what? I am a disgraced 80-year-old man that tends to animals. I had my shot and I blew it. Who am I? That's the question I've wrestled with my whole life. Who am I? Am I Israel? Am I Hebrew? Am I Egyptian? I don't know what I am, but I'm 80 and it's done. My story is over, dog. Use someone else. Find someone else. Who am I and who are you anyways? This burning bush, that's crazy, man. I know the stories of old. You did it then. I don't believe you'll do it now. Who are you? Who am I? And who are you? And so I'm sitting at that corner table with Mike, and he's quiet, and he's crying, and he's struggling to get his words out, and he is fully exposed and vulnerable. And in the blink of an eye, he has come in touch with that part of his life that he thought grace couldn't touch. And there's a word for that. It's the word for the parts of our own lives that at least in our own minds, grace can't touch. There's a word for that, and the word is shame. Who am I? Who are you, God? Those are the questions coming from Moses' shame. See, shame is easy to feel, but it's hard to define. Shame becomes a story that we tell ourselves. Shame is when guilt or insecurity gets its call into our sense of identity. Guilt says, I did something wrong, and shame says, something is wrong with me, unmendable and unfixable. You all have your own version of what shame is, and if you can't articulate in words, I bet it's a feeling maybe that's popping up or something you're trying to repress. Y'all remember Will Smith, how he used to be like famous in front of people? And then he had that moment on a stage, and he's not been around for a while, and How many of you could recite the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme song right now? About everybody? Yes. Don't do it, Matt. Don't do it. Okay. And so I'm not saying this is why this happened on that familiar Oscars stage, but I'm not saying it's not. And I'm not going to psychoanalyze him, but I'm going to point you to something that Will Smith has said on his own in his own memoir, written by himself. There's a moment in his childhood that forever shaped him, as he writes it. And so he's just a kid, and he witnesses something he shouldn't have to see. He witnesses his dad abusing his mom, right there in the family living room. And as it was happening, he says he just froze. He's the oldest sibling, and this for him is a defining moment for him to step up, right? To fight back, to defend his mom. After all, he is the oldest. But as he says it, he didn't do that. He just froze. And then his little brother, who had been standing behind him, steps around him in his frozenness and past him, steps in and defends their mom against their dad. And that, says Will, is the defining moment of my life. It's the one I've never stopped living in response to. It's the moment I've tried to protect myself from ever being in again, and I've tried to prove to everyone that is not the person that I am. That is shame. It's a story we tell. It's the part of Will's life that grace hasn't touched yet. And that's what shame is for you and I. It's the part of our stories, the part that we keep bottled up and hidden that we don't think grace can touch. And so instead of being redeemed by an author and by the Jesus that we follow, shame gets to become the author holding the pen of our life story. That's what I mean when I say that shame is easy to feel, but it's almost impossible to define because it's a story that we often live in response to. It's the friction point that determines direction and trajectory that we live off of. It's like a headwind that we can never have power over. Shame is the dad who left before you ever got to know him, who never wanted to be part of your life, and so yet somehow the person you've never met or barely know has become the most defining character in your life. Shame is the way your first boyfriend made you feel when you were 15, who defined you by some minimization of your dignity, and it's a feeling that you've never been able to fully shake. Shame is the part of your family of origin that you learn to hide. It's your parents' infidelity or your mom's secret addiction. It is your lack or your plenty. Shame is the person you never want to become but are afraid you might actually be. It's how you never want to be defined, so you're constantly defining yourself on your terms against it. Shame is the story that we say God's grace can't touch. And so instead of being redeemed by Jesus as the author, shame becomes the author. And shame is a shorthand word for forgetting. For forgetting who God is. For forgetting who I am. And so in the midst of shame and the stories we tell ourselves, there are two questions that we should be pointing directly at God. They are the same questions Moses asked. Who am I? And who are you, God? And if I get emotional on this one, forgive me. But I'll never forget the shame that I felt the first time I lost my cool at my two oldest girls. We were at home together on a Friday. And Fridays are supposed to be these forever beautiful bonding days home with Dad and his daughters before they get to kindergarten. These days are over. And time is a thief because Sydney is already a couple months away from this part of our relationship being over. Fridays at home with Dad. It's this weekly day off I haven't had in a while, but I'm working on it, to spend with the girls, a weekly rhythm. And so here we are on another Friday hanging out at home, and I'm supposed to be enjoying it. I'm supposed to be enjoying my children. It's supposed to be roses and daisies and pixie dust and candy and pancakes and screen time and parks and all the things that you're just trying to transact your way into more love towards me than their mom, as if that's possible. And so here we are on another Friday, hanging out at home. But the stress of the week and the tension that I'm prone to keep bottled in, and my inability to control much of anything, including the environment of my own home, it just all spilled out. And as I'm losing my temper and making demands on a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old that should never be put on them, suddenly it was like I could see myself. And I always assumed that I would just be a good dad, like a great dad. I had a great dad, have a great dad. But in that moment, I hated the person I was. I hated the man that I was. And I just assumed that that would never be me. Who loses their temper at 3 and 4-year-olds? And so I, the pastor who often sits with others in their struggles, found myself on the other end of a chair in a room with my own counselor trying to work through it. And we talked, and I came back, and a couple weeks later, it boiled down to these same 2 questions. Well, Matt, who are you? And who is God? Who am I? And who are you, God? You see, when we reduce God to Elohim, we lose who we are. But when God is Yahweh, we become so fully in touch with who we are and who we are to become that everything changes. Yahweh takes those 2 questions and he doesn't throw shame back at us. He takes the pen out of our hands, out of the grip of the power of shame, and he writes a new story. And all of a sudden, not instantly, he begins to pen statements like, I am hidden in Christ. I'm fully yours and you are mine. I'm your beloved. I've been made in your image. You knew me before anything. You formed me in my mother's womb. And every wound that I have, Jesus brought to healing and bear on the cross, and he redeems everything. You see, when we point our questions of who we are and who God is right at him, he looks us like Jesus looked across Peter in that moment before he went to the cross, and Peter has denied him, and he never thought he'd do that, and he just looks at him with such a look that he became unraveled. And I don't believe he became unraveled because Jesus shamed him. I believe that Peter was shaming himself, and God, the good Father of love and mercy, looked at him with such love that he became unraveled, because Peter knew what Mike thought, which was what I think and every one of us thinks, that there are parts of us that are so far gone, they're past the point that grace can reach. That is what shame is. And I don't know about what your experience with shame is, or about what your experience of shame is for someone that you love. But shame grows a lot less cute the older it gets. Oh, that's just so-and-so. Well, at a certain point, it's not cute. It's sad, and it's the very place that God wants to step in. Moses is shame grown up. He is 80 years old. And he looks at God and he says, who am I? And who are you? Moses was afraid to look at God. One way to interpret that is it's just literally a posture of shame. I can't look at you. I don't deserve you. You got the wrong guy, God. Who am I? And I love what God's response to that is. That the first thing he tells him isn't a statement of affirmation. As good as that is, it's not even a statement of acceptance, although it is, if you read between the lines. It's a statement that just says, I'll be with you. I'm with you. I'm with you. In other words, Moses, you are mine. You belong to me. You are mine, and I am yours. And one of the ways that you, as you point that question of who you are to God, you begin to grow in a sense of your own identity is when you can live into the fact that you belong to Jesus. You don't belong to your past. You don't belong to the power of sin in your life. You don't belong to the thing, the shame-shaping story in your life that is the thing you're living against your whole life. He's like, I belong to Jesus. And when Moses asked that, God says, I'm with you. And then Moses asks, well, who are you, God? And God says, I'm Yahweh. I'm Yahweh. I'm the personal God that's been personal all along. I have a track record. If you will look, if you will ask, if you will tell the stories, if you will tune your heart and that question of who you are to exactly who I am and who you are, you will find healing, and purpose, and wholeness, and life. I'm Yahweh. I'm the God of every good promise. I'm the God with a proven track record. And I'm the God of all things and the Redeemer of your if-onlys. I'm the God who longs to take the pen out of the storyteller that is shame. And this profound statement from God to Moses in his struggle and in his question and in his shame, he's not just telling him his name, he's giving him an invitation. And the invitation is, in light of who I am, Moses, and in light of who I'm going to show you you are, will you trust me? Will you trust that I am who I say I am so that you can trust that you are who I say you are? Will you trust that I don't change? You see, this is how God gets his work done. He heals the world by healing you. He heals your family by healing you. He heals our community by healing us. He heals the world, one life, one Moses, one redemptive story, one person stuck in a story of shame at a time. Think about it. God wants to deliver millions of people. And so he goes and finds the one that had hidden and ran himself away and out of that story because of his shame. And he's like, you? Here. I'm going to do my thing. See, this whole thing, I keep coming back to it. It's not a story about people who escape and find the great strategy and work their way out of it. It's about a God who rescues. And one of the ways he rescues, my friends, is to heal your shame. Moses' story is a lot of things, but at the root, it is about God exposing that untouchable, that bottled up place inside of him and saying, my grace meets you there. Sitting at the table with Mike that morning, shame got exposed to a God who reminded him what shame made him forget. You are Yahweh, and I am yours. Who am I? And who are you, God? That's the two questions. So let me invite you to stand. I want to ask you two questions this morning. I just want you to encourage you to allow, however all this works, to just be vulnerable to God's Spirit this morning, so that in his kindness and his gentleness that leads to repentance and the changing of our own story can begin to change the power of shame in your life. And so, Jesus, we ask for every sense of scattered senses and warring minds and distractions to just fall for a moment so that we can focus our hearts on these questions. And the first question I want to invite you into this morning is this. What is the part of your story, the part of you that you believe grace cannot touch? Is there a hidden place, a bottled up place, a never thought of again person? What's the part of you in your story that you believe grace can't touch? As you think about that, and we invite the Spirit to reveal that to you, let me embolden you with this thought. That whatever it is that you're vulnerable to expose or allow or pay attention to, that the Holy Spirit might be prompting you towards right now, everything that wants to keep that hidden and bottled and not vulnerable, that's just the power of shame. That's not how God's grace works. So what part of you And the second is this: what have you forgotten? What have you forgotten? Who have you forgotten? Yahweh, would you reintroduce yourself this morning? Elohim, would you become Yahweh? Would you break up the fallow ground so that it can begin to produce a harvest again? God, you're the same God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses that's present here this morning. The rewriting of personal stories of shame is not new to you. It may feel massive and too much to overcome to us, and that's fair and that's legitimate. But Yahweh, this is who you are. Thank you. Thank you that you're rewriting stories. Would you loosen the grip of those stories? And may we, in our vulnerability and surrender at the end of our ropes, ask for your help, because you hear our cries and you're writing a huge story. And maybe it's going to become super personal today. Help us to remember and help us to become undone. So as we sing, may this be like a fragrant offering of our praise, our vulnerability, our surrender. And would you meet us? Would you inhabit this moment in a way that is unexpected? And like you did on an ordinary Tuesday in Taylor Books with Mike and I, when folks came in this morning just like, I am so pumped that we showed up on a day where we lost sleep and my kids are a wreck, and that's maybe all that they came expecting. Do the unexpected. Help us remember. We love you, Jesus.